Hi, you're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astel's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, we're talking about the relationship between food, identity, and tradition. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to episode 58 of Bonus Points. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the connection between food and tradition. I want to give a shout out here to one of my students for inspiring this episode. A few weeks ago, I gave my classes a journal prompt asking about their family's weird traditions. One student mentioned how their family, who has German ancestry, makes a few different German dishes throughout the year. What struck me was the reason. This student specifically said that their family has these dinners specifically so that they can be passed down. That really got me thinking about the role of food in our families, and especially how that applies across the generations. That also gives us a good opportunity to talk about tradition in general, which is, something we love as Catholics. And yes, the song from Fiddler on the Roof has been stuck in my head since I started planning this episode. I'll have a link in the show notes just in case you haven't heard it yet. Before we start, a friendly reminder that you can subscribe to Bonus Points wherever you listen to podcasts and get notified every time a new episode comes out. You can also visit our website, bonuspointspodcast.com, for lots of information about each episode. That's also where you can share your ideas for future topics or ask questions for the next Question and Astel. Okay, so here's the plan. We're going to start with the concept of tradition in general. While we won't be getting too deep into what Catholics call sacred tradition, there are obviously some good connections we can make, and I'll have some resources if you do want to know more about that specific kind of tradition. Then we're going to talk about some connections between food and tradition. There's a reason that food is an important part of pretty much every culture's traditions. And then finally, we'll talk about meals in the Bible and how the Mass is the ultimate traditional meal, even if it is also so much more. By the way, I didn't plan for this episode to come out during Lent, so sorry if today's food-themed episode is making your Lenten fast more difficult. Anyway, let's start with the idea of tradition. Tradition is one of those words that, feels like it has taken on some baggage. Like, there are many words that we use and, we feel pretty neutral about them. But then there are words that, when you hear them, they catch your attention more, for better or for worse. Some of you listening hear the word tradition, and it immediately leaves a bad taste in your mouth. For you, it has this negative connotation of something stuffy and old. You may think that traditions were made to be broken, or at least that traditions are always secondary to our preferences and desires in the moment. In some sense, you may think of tradition as just another word for doing something because that's the way we've always done it. You may have encountered people who use tradition as an excuse to reject newer ways of doing things, even if they may prove to be better. On the other hand, some of you listening hear the word tradition, and you think of something solid, something reliable and stable. When you think about traditions, you think about how they form connections with the past, and you can see those connections stretching back through history like a chain. Those who want to replace traditions are trying to sever those links and discard all that came before. The first person I mentioned, you may see them as being egotistical or thinking they're smarter or better than those who came before. You love phrases like, "Don't reinvent the wheel," and "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Now, okay, maybe you don't really fall into either of those camps, or at least you don't think that you're as stereotypical as what I just described. No matter what reaction you had to the word tradition, I think it's a safe bet that you had some reaction. I would invite you to step out of those initial responses, at least for now. Leave some of that baggage here in the lobby for the next few minutes. If we're going to talk about tradition, I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing, not what's already in your head. So let's start with a definition. We can define tradition as that which is handed on or passed down. In fact, the word tradition comes from the Latin tradere, which means to hand over, from trans, over, and dare, to give. Also, fun fact, this is where we get the word traitor, as in a betrayer. A traitor is someone who hands over something like an ally or information. Okay, one more fun etymology fact. I assume that this was also where we got the word trader, as in somebody who trades. It makes sense, right? They hand things over. Except that's not where the word trader comes from. Trader comes from trade in the sense of a profession, which comes from the Old English for treading a path. So trader and trader are false cognates, meaning they seem like they share the same origin word, but they don't. What were we talking about again? Oh yeah, tradition comes from the word tradere, to hand over. We can also think of it as handing on or passing down, because the word is especially used to talk about passing something down from one generation to the next. I like to imagine a baton in a relay race, or a treasure chest. I think the treasure chest image is particularly helpful if we are talking about sacred tradition, the capital T tradition in the church. This process of handing things on has three basic parts. You have something that is being handed on. You have the act of handing something on and, something to hand on. You have the person who has the baton who needs to extend it to the next person in the race. And then you also have that act of receiving what was handed on. The runner has to accept the baton. So 4 parts, I suppose, if you want to do it that way. You have the first runner, the second runner, the baton, and then the actions involved. You have the act of handing it on, and then you have the act of receiving it. So wait, now that's 5. Hold on. Something's not right there. Well, no matter however you want to count it, you have to have both parts, right? The act of handing something on the part of the first person, and the act of receiving what was handed on the second. So, and then of course you have the thing that's handed on. So let's start there. Let's start with what is being handed on. If you paid attention to our definition, you can see that it doesn't make any value claims about tradition. I could hand on something good, or not. I could pass down a priceless treasure or a piece of junk. Or worse, I could hand on something harmful. If you're one of those people who's mistrustful of tradition, that's probably what you've realized by now. Just because it was passed down doesn't mean it's any good. Now, if we're talking about sacred tradition as Catholics, we don't have to worry about that. Because when we talk about sacred tradition, we are referring to the deposit of faith, what we believe. And that deposit was handed down to us from Jesus through the apostles and their successors. If it were possible for Jesus to hand on something ineffective or incorrect, then we wouldn't be speaking so strongly about tradition. But if Jesus is who he says he is, if he is the way, the truth, and the life, then we can trust that the truths that he gave to the apostles are absolutely reliable. This, by the way, is what we mean when we talk about that capital T tradition. When we talk about scripture and tradition being on the same level, we're talking about the faith and morals that were given to us by Jesus and passed down through the teaching of the church. We have a lot of fun little t traditions as well, like eating fish on Fridays, but those are fundamentally in a separate category than sacred tradition. For our purposes today, we're only talking about those little t traditions. All those other things that are passed down from one generation to the next, for better or for worse. Okay, so just because something is a tradition doesn't inherently make it good or bad, because you can hand on something priceless as easily as you can hand on something worthless. This is where we should consider the other parts of that process. Again, in order for something to be passed down, you need somebody to hand it on and somebody to receive it. If either part of this process fails, there is no tradition. And either part of this process can fail deliberately or accidentally. Sometimes traditions get lost just because they were never passed on. They weren't intentionally stopped, they just weren't given to the next generation. Other times, there is a very deliberate decision not to pass something on. I'll save my full thoughts on traditional Catholicism for its own episode, but this has been the experience of many young people who are now discovering the traditional side of Catholicism. They're eager for a tradition that was never handed on to them, that they're now discovering on their own. It's like finding a family heirloom in the attic, or heck, in the antique store. There can be a sense of frustration or even anger. Like, this was my inheritance. Why was it being withheld? Why am I only finding out about this now on my own? Other times, traditions can be lost because the next generation does not have the ability or the interest to receive it. Again, sometimes things just fall by the wayside. Other times there is a deliberate effort not to incorporate that tradition and continue it. When we take all of this into account, it becomes clear that traditions don't just happen. There has to be effort on the part of both generations. Working in a high school, I have seen all of the above scenarios, especially when teachers or classes try to start traditions for the underclassmen. Sometimes they underestimate the level of effort that is going to be required. Even maintaining traditions doesn't happen automatically. It has to be intentional. I think this is where food enters the picture. Many traditions, or many of the most important traditions, have to do with how we understand and interact with the world. They touch every area of life, but some of the strongest traditions relate to the most important areas of life, like eating. Sometimes we can fall into a very utilitarian way of thinking about food. What I mean is that our society tends to reduce things to their usefulness. We're all about efficiency and productivity, and so we try to view everything through that lens. If that is how we approach food, then we can start thinking of food as little more than fuel. We plug in our phones so that they have enough energy, we eat so that we have enough energy. That's going to affect the kinds of food we eat and the way we eat it. If that's our approach, the primary question is going to become, how effective is this food as a source of nutrition? And other qualities are going to fall by the wayside. And no, this is not me saying that nutrition doesn't matter. We do have a responsibility to take care of our bodies. What I'm saying is that this isn't the only thing to think about when we're choosing what to eat. We aren't robots, and food isn't just the thing that keeps us running. I've talked about Gnosticism in previous episodes, this idea that creation is bad and our bodies are bad. I think that if we reduce food to fuel, we're guilty of a sort of hidden Gnosticism, because it says that meals are more of an inconvenience or a necessary evil. Like, oh man, it would be nice if we didn't have to stop working to eat, but we do, so I guess I'll just find something efficient so that I can move on. This won't just affect what we eat, but it'll also affect the way we eat. Now, I know that sometimes a busy schedule means we don't have many options, but there's such a qualitative difference between that quick meal that I eat at my desk while I'm working on something and a meal that is enjoyed with others. Even if I can't take that 2-hour lunch at a bistro every day as much as I would like to, we need to stop thinking of meals as quick pit stops and start seeing them as opportunities to come together with others and thank God for the goodness of creation. The need for food is not just a byproduct of organic chemistry. I think that God designed this intentionally to make us slow down, to remember our dependence on Him, and to spend more time with others. So what does all of this have to do with tradition? Well, I think that because food is more than fuel, meals become important traditions. Let's start with this idea of ancestral dishes, or those foods and recipes or meals that have been passed down to us. This would include recipes that we would consider part of our family's ethnic history. For many of us listening who are Americans, that might be the food that our ancestors ate in the old country and then brought with them to the United States. But I'm also imagining recipes that may not be quite as old, but are still passed down. Your mom's recipes, your grandma's. I think for most of us, when we think of food and tradition together, this is one of the first things we think of. And part of that is because for many of us, we form such strong memories around food growing up. Memories get encoded or stored in your mind better when there's more sensory data. That's why smells can be such a powerful trigger for memory. The smell of a certain meal cooking can just snap you right back, even if you can't remember what you had for breakfast. When I graduated from college, I moved out here to State College, and that was really the first time I had been responsible for feeding myself. Because I lived on campus all the way through college, I always had a meal plan, so I never had to learn to cook. Even if I did here and there wasn't much pressure because I knew that I didn't really have to know. Well, here I was on my own, and I knew that I couldn't afford to get takeout every night as much as I'd like to, so I had to figure it out. At that point, I could cook a mean grilled cheese, and I could make scrambled eggs, and that was probably about it. If you had asked me to cook anything else, I wouldn't have been able to, at least not without doing some pretty heavy Googling first. So I knew I needed to know more. I found this app that was like a cooking app for beginners. It would give you 3 recipes at a time, each of which served 1 or 2 people, and they all had overlapping ingredients, so you didn't have all this extra stuff in your fridge going bad. The app had simple recipes with lots of pictures, which was nice. Actually, that gave me a good bit of confidence, because I'd never realized how easy it was to cook. Really, as long as you can follow instructions, you'll be fine. I also started watching Good Eats with Alton Brown, which was on Netflix at the time. I watched this because I remembered my mom watching it growing up. And I love that show because it talked about the science behind cooking, which made it easier to understand what was happening. I don't know about you, but it's a lot easier for me to remember and understand procedures if I know the reason behind them. I mention all of this because my experience of learning to cook is common nowadays, but it's certainly not the historical norm. For the most part, you'd learn to cook at home, usually taught by your mom. And this is not a dig at my mom, by the way. She's a great cook and happily would have taught me if I'd shown the least interest. Unfortunately, me being me, I didn't think about it until I was already on my own. But anyway, if you learned to cook from your mom, you wouldn't just learn different cooking skills and basic practices, you'd also be learning recipes. Probably the same recipes you grew up eating. These ancestral dishes would be passed down very naturally, without even really thinking about tradition or anything like that. For me, and I think for most people, most of the things I cook came from the internet. Even if I've modified recipes and made them my own over the years, if you go back far enough, you'll find me Googling what I want for dinner and looking for a recipe that has good reviews. But I also recognize that sometimes there is a desire to make something the way my mom made it. A few months ago, I was really craving my mom's Mexican pie, and I opened up a tab and started Googling recipes for Mexican pies, and then I realized that's not what I want. That's not going to hit the spot. I don't want what this blogger or this food website says are the best Mexican pie ever. I want it the way my mom made it. So I asked her for the recipe instead. I mention that example because ancestral foods don't have to be hundreds of years old. If a tradition is something that is handed on, all it takes is one generation to pass it down. My mom didn't learn how to make Mexican pie from her mom. It wasn't a food from the old country, from Italy or Poland. My mom learned it from a pre-internet relic known as a cookbook, or a recipe clipped out of a magazine. I hope my kids want to learn to cook, and so far, John already loves to help out as much as a 2-year-old possibly can. So who knows, maybe one day he'll be talking about traditional recipes, and he'll mention the home fries that Dad made growing up, even if I did get the recipe from a blog. Before I move on, I do want to take a moment to mention those ancestral meals that do go back a bit further. I'm thinking of those meals or those recipes that are particular to your family's culture. You know, your ancestors have been eating this meal for hundreds of years perhaps. They brought it over from the old country. I think that these are the food traditions that are in most danger of being lost, because they require the most intentional effort to pass on. Often these recipes are time and labor intensive, because after all, they didn't have Instant Pots on the ship that brought them to Ellis Island. It's going to require a commitment to make these recipes, so it's probably going to wait for a special occasion. And let's be honest, not all of these meals taste that great. I feel like every culture has that one dish that is super traditional and very important and just not good. I would argue that we should keep making it anyway. These ancestral traditions, these ancestral dishes, are a connection with our family's history, a tangible link to the past. And for me, that's worth keeping at least some of them on the menu. But maybe not that often. Finally, I can't have a theology-themed podcast with a whole episode dedicated to meals and tradition without mentioning the Mass. This is the traditional meal par excellence. Throughout the Bible, all sorts of important moments are marked with some sort of meal. Go back to Genesis when the 3 angels appeared to Abraham to tell him that God will give him and Sarah a son. That conversation happens as Sarah is preparing food for the visitors. In Exodus, God's redemption of the Israelites involves a ritual sacrificial meal, the Passover. This meal saved their lives. After all, remember, God didn't just tell them to kill the lamb, but to eat it. In fact, this meal became a yearly memorial, an annual ritual meal, to remind every generation of Israelites what God had done for their ancestors. How do you pass down the story? How do you hand on the story? By handing on the meal. A few chapters later in Exodus, Moses goes up Mount Sinai to receive the law and the instructions for the tabernacle, what would later become the temple. But that's not all that happens on the mountain. Exodus says, they beheld God and ate and drank. Whenever a covenant was made, there were a few ritual elements that were usually included, and one of these was sharing a meal. Even the prophets believed when the Messiah came, he was going to institute this miraculous feast with superabundant bread and wine. And of course, in the New Testament, 2 of Jesus' most important miracles involve providing miraculous quantities of bread at the multiplication of the loaves and wine at the wedding of Cana. After the resurrection, on multiple occasions, Jesus appears to disciples in the context of a meal, like when he had breakfast with the apostles in John 21, or when he eats with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And of course, the most important meal that is mentioned in Scripture, the most important meal in history, is the Last Supper. Why is this important? This isn't just Jesus' last time eating with his friends before he dies. This is the new Passover meal, where the new Passover lamb is consumed. This is where Jesus institutes the new covenant in his blood by giving his body and blood to be consumed. Earlier, after the miracle of the loaves, Jesus has said that we must eat his flesh and drink his blood if we want to have eternal life. Here, he gives us a way to do that. But Jesus didn't just want to save the people who happened to be living at the same time and place as he did. He tells the apostles, "Do this in memory of me." By doing this, Jesus institutes the Mass. He gives us a way to participate in the Last Supper, to mystically stand at the foot of the cross. The new Passover, like the old, would be a repeated memorial, but it's not a repetition. Even if the Eucharist is the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, we don't re-crucify Jesus. We don't pull him down from the cross onto our altars. Instead, we believe that the Mass represents the Last Supper, the cross, and the resurrection. To represent means that it forms a real connection between the past and the present. It brings those events into our time every time we're at Mass. This is why we say that the Mass is both a sacrifice and a common meal. Sometimes people try to pit those two against each other. To oversimplify, some people who are more traditional emphasize how the Mass is a sacrifice, and others say that Since Vatican II, we've changed our focus to how the Mass is a family meal. I've said it a million times before, Catholicism is a both-and religion. These two aspects are not at odds with each other. The Mass is both a sacrifice and a family meal, just like the Passover, and just like the Last Supper. So what can our takeaways be here? Well, this should affect the way we go to Mass and the way we approach our ordinary meals. When we go to Mass, we should keep in mind that it's more than just a Sunday morning Jesus fan club. It's not just a nice chance to listen to the Bible and sing a few songs. At the Mass, we encounter the real presence of Christ. We are brought into the upper room, to Golgotha, to the empty tomb. The food that we receive at Mass is true food and true drink, the bread of angels and the medicine of immortality. It is unlike any other food we consume, which is why we fast from other foods before receiving it. Just as natural food nourishes our natural life, we can remind ourselves that the Eucharist is supernatural food to nourish our supernatural life. Outside of the Mass, there are a few things we can keep in mind when we sit down to eat a regular meal as well. We can remember that all the food we eat has come from creation, either directly or indirectly. Ultimately, we should thank God for nourishing us at every meal, which is exactly why we say grace. We can also make a conscious effort to use meals as an opportunity to connect. We can connect with others around us, we can connect with family, we can even connect with the generations gone by. Oh, and if you're one of my students listening, or even if you're not, put the phone away at the lunch table. Talk to each other, for goodness sake. Alright, that's going to do it for today's episode. I'm going to go have a snack now. Before I go, I have a few resources to leave you with today. I'll have a link to the song Tradition from Fiddler on the Roof so that it can be stuck in your head too. I'm linking to 2 entries from an etymology site about the origins of the word traitor and traitor. I'm linking to part of the catechism that talks about sacred tradition, if you do want to know more about that capital T tradition. And there are so many good books on the Eucharist that I was tempted to link my entire library. Instead, I chose 3 that focus on the Eucharist as a sacrificial meal, and especially the ones that make connections with the Old Testament. I'll be linking to Consuming the Word and The Lamb's Supper, both by Scott Hahn, as well as Brant Petra's Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. Finally, if you'd like to add some Catholic flair to your kitchen, I'm linking to 2 cookbooks. The first one, Cooking with the Saints, has recipes inspired by the saints and their cultures to help you celebrate feast days with actual feasts throughout the year. The second one is the Vatican Cookbook, compiled by the Swiss Guard. As you'd expect, it has a collection of recipes that have been popular in the papal kitchen over time. As always, you can find these links in the episode guide on bonuspointspodcast.com. There you can also share your ideas for future episodes and ask questions to be answered on our next episode of Question and Astle. Until then, I am Mr. Astle. Thank you for joining us once again as we continue every episode to put out into the deep to explore the world of theology and beyond.